And that brings us to correspondence. Mr. Rogie?
Yes, Madam President, we have some correspondence. This first one is from Dana Meistercheck. She states, I would support a parcel tax to benefit all the schools in the city of Livermore. I have 2 kids at a charter school and 1 at Granada. Next one's from Teresa Zeminski Myers. I am writing today as a mother of 2 school-aged boys. I support the partial tax measure in the community previously, and I continue to support it now. I'm an advocate for all the schools of Livermore. Do not urge one over the other, but always tell parents to choose the solutions that best work for their child, as every child learns differently. I urge you to keep the public funds generated from the parcel tax available for all the public schools and all the families of Livermore. And the last is from Pam Brown. I have children at both LVJUSD and the charter. I am in support of the parcel tax and would appreciate it if it were to also benefit the charter. That concludes it.
And that brings us to the consent items, the motion. And Mr. Rogie's told me that he wants to talk about item G, so.
Yes, I just have some questions. I believe Mr. Ranchak might have these answers. There are verifications for student attendance from the Livermore district in the charter, but is there any verification that a student is from a property tax household in Livermore that generates revenue from the parcel? Is there any way to verify that?
That's a good question. I'd say we don't have a process in place yet to do that, but that's certainly something we can look into to determine whether or not the folks are from those types of homes.
And then the other question, is there going to be a snapshot of services before the parcel tax and then?
Wait a minute. Yeah, I think before we move on to another question, you know, any student who lives within the boundaries of the Livermore School District is going to generate property tax one way or another. Because if they're in our attendance district, they're paying property taxes to Alameda County. And
so someone is paying on behalf of the resident wherever they reside. So whether it's them directly or the landlord who owns it, there would be funds generated from the home. I guess with the exception of if they were homeless or in the homeless shelter, that might not be the case. But I think that's a very small group of students, and I'm not sure if there are many at the charter. So I guess I would say there wouldn't really be a compelling reason.
I guess the question I thought he was asking is there a way to verify that the address is an accurate one for a student attending school? Was that the?
That's it. I mean, you get students that are from out of the area that latch onto a aunt or something that they really reside in, say, San Leandro, but they're not paying property taxes.
But their in-district enrollment has to be verified, and it would be the same process.
That we would verify our own enrollment.
Now, if a student lived with an elderly adult who had taken the senior citizen exemption, but that would be the same for our students, that they may have been exempted themselves, but then they wouldn't be necessarily paying the parcel tax. That's the other instance. But I mean, we don't do that for our own families. So I guess I would wonder why we would want to.
I think we could verify enrollment similar that we would do for a transfer request. Is an address an accurate address? Those are the sorts of verifications we do. Is that kind of what you're having in mind?
Well, I'm glad the discussion took place because it really just kind of struck me is that you might have 1 or 2 students that might not be generating parcel tax, but what's the point of verifying and statistically that we're not having a problem with it? That maybe it's a non-question at this point.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand the point because there are a lot of households paying tax with no children. You know, that the parcel tax is to support the public schools of Livermore, and it's really irrelevant whether someone has a student in school or not. That it's the citizens of Livermore banding together to give a little bit of extra funding, that $138 a year, to support the public school students.
I think in regard to the MOU, perhaps the question is because the funds that would be generated by the charter school would be dependent upon the number of students that they have who reside in Livermore. And so if your question is, are we going to do a verification to determine if those are actually students in Livermore, because that's how we base their funding, I would say yes, we would certainly want to verify.
Do.
Yeah.
When they do their property requests.
Yeah, the Prop 39 request is a verification.
I tell you, at 11:30 this morning, it sounded better in my head than it did now. So, I do have another
the opportunity to have all questions processed through, and so it's fine.
The other question I have is, from the parcel tax, since we now are going forward with money to the charter, will there be a snapshot of services that they currently have, and then after the parcel hopefully passes, that those services that are in the parcel that we're going to take a look at, see that they are producing those services that charter like we have to. And I'm going to assume, well, that the I forgot the committee.
Parcel tax
Oversight. The oversight committee.
Committee is going to look at both us and the charter.
Right. They're going to be required to provide the same documentation for use of funds as the Livermore School District does, and so we certainly have their before budget, which is current, and there are expected uses for the parcel tax funds, and we certainly would have their after budget. But I think the oversight committee would be responsible for taking a look at those and determining whether or not their uses are appropriate.
And then any way, shape, or form will the if we do not oversight the charter at some point, will that affect parcel tax?
The way that the MOU is currently written, because we don't currently oversee the high school, that was not a condition of the sharing of a pro rata portion of the parcel tax income. Who does the oversight was not the issue. It was more that we limit it to the 2 existing schools with a cap on their enrollment portion. So even if their enrollment were to grow, the proportion amount has a cap. And so that was just for everyone's sake, for budgeting purposes, so that we weren't going to have to make so many continual adjustments. But we currently don't oversee the high school, and they were still included, and we do oversee LVCS. I think actually what will happen, though, in the case of LVCS, they're very used to oversight and sharing everything. LVCP has not, so they will be now sharing, whether we have oversight or not, they will now have to share their budgets with the independent oversight committee if Measure G is successful.
And if they don't choose to, then they're not going to, they risk not getting funds in the future if they don't account for the expenditures and in the allowable categories.
Well, thank you for the clarification.
It seems to me that the allowable categories are very broad. And for me, one of the reasons for the success of the Livermore renewal of our parcel tax, as it's been done in the past, is that we have been able to specify up front what we're going to pay for. We pay for technology and class size reduction and the science program and counselors and enrichment classes. I mean, there's 5 things, not in this one, but on the other ones, and we were able to talk about those during the campaign. It would seem to me it would be not unreasonable to ask the charter school to tell us up front as part of their campaign what they're going to spend their money on. Because I would, you know, like I say, the specifics are not in the charter, in the ballot measure, and they could spend it on things which I think would be unacceptable, but be within the range of the allowances. And so I do hope that before they propose something, that, I mean, before we send the money, that we have a specific proposal for what it's going to be.
I think the point of having the MOU is to govern the relationship.
But I'd also like to clarify that the ballot language is limited to 75 words, so it is not full and extensive. It has to really be very sparse. But the full text of the measure is very specific, and that's pages long. And there's also an argument in favor, and that has many more details. So I think what I would do as part of our information sharing, because as the district we can't campaign, or advocate anyway, but we can certainly share information. We can make sure that people see the full text of the ballot, which is very precise, and that is what I believe they're held to by the Independent Oversight Committee, is not just the 75 words on the page. So that would be, I think you would feel a better comfort level both about what we're asking the community for. I think the community would feel better as well to know what the specifics are, and then certainly any specificity that we provide, we would expect of the charter. It isn't supposed to be just handing money over with carte blanche, free reign.
The background of the MOU states the 5, 6 things that are going to be in the tax that were parcel tax would raise local revenue to provide advanced courses in math, science, and engineering, keep schools well maintained, attract and retain qualified teachers, provide elementary school science and technology.
But you could give everybody a raise and attract and retain highly qualified teachers. You could have the school painted, and that would provide well-maintained schools. And I don't think that's the sense of what the community wants the money spent on.
Well, and I guess that is the point of having a parcel tax oversight committee of community members to make sure that they're appropriate expenditures and justifiable and answerable to the community.
But the parcel tax oversight committee does not meet until after the money's spent. You know, they meet in June after the year's over and verify that it was spent on.
Yes, but there are 7 years that we're asking for renewal. And if it is not believed that it was appropriately spent,
but if
there are provisions in the MOU.
But not here. I mean, if it says attract and retain highly qualified teachers.
Okay, do you have the entire MOU where it talks about that if they don't provide?
Yeah, but giving all their staff a raise with the money would in fact come under the category of attracting and retaining highly qualified teachers.
The school is obligated to expend parcel tax revenues in compliance with the terms set forth in the parcel tax resolution, the ballot language of the parcel tax, and any amendments thereto and applicable law. And then it goes on to state that if they fail to comply, that they're in jeopardy of not receiving future.
What I believe that Trustee White is saying is that possibly pre-meetings, when and if Measure G were to pass, pre-meetings to firm up a common understanding of the argument in favor and the entire ballot text.
Yeah,
because
I think we need to see
what the community polled and favored in relation to attracting and retaining high quality teachers had to do mostly with lower class size. That's the way it comes out in the large text, and so that would be what we would be holding to, as well as what they would be holding to. So I guess what I'm envisioning would be if Measure G were to be successful, then there would be a common understanding of both boards, both staff, both administrative staffs of what it entails, and that would then guide the work of the parcel tax independent oversight committee. Is that really, because your concern is that they meet later.
Well, that's only the oversight committee issue. I think that the spending of the money to increase the salaries would fall under those 5 things. So the parcel tax committee would have no leg to stand on if they objected. Now, I would like to see the text of the whole ballot issue, and maybe it's further defined in that more carefully.
Well, it sounds to me like,
I mean, and I don't think, you know, we need
excuse me, it sounds to me like we have a problem. And it sounds to me like we need to pull this item, because if you want a budget from the charter schools on what they intend to expend their share on, then I think it needs to come before we enter into an MOU. And I wish that I had heard any of these objections in the weeks that we've been talking about it, rather than when we put it on consent, because we hadn't heard any of these objections.
Mrs. Runyon, I have written to Mrs. Bowers on this topic at least once.
Okay, so what I'm saying is I would interject. What you have brought up is not related to this item. This item is an MOU to share. What I have heard you bring up is a concern about the parcel tax oversight committee only evaluating once the funds are expended. So that could be answered in a different kind of an agenda item at a future meeting that doesn't have to affect the MOU. That could be answered in a parcel tax, presentation of facts, or getting input on what the board would prefer. But it's all hypothetical because we don't have a parcel tax that has passed. Measure G has just been placed on the ballot. So this is just positioning toward going forward. So I guess that to me might be a different agenda item that maybe Mrs. White is requesting to say, maybe for either partial tax oversight or what to do if we were to pass it. If it passes, I would say the next meeting after that to have an agenda item that talks about the processes and hear what the board feels comfortable with. But I don't know if that really has bearing for the sharing.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of issues with what was just said, but I'm going to let Dr. Dunlop have the floor first because.
No, I was just going to interject that, we're going to have a partial tax election, but we don't lose our responsibility for the management of funds, when the election comes. We will see the presentation of of the oversight committee. We'll see the presentations of the superintendent about how the money is planned to be spent, and we have authority to say, well, why don't we look at that differently? Now, we can't go against what the measure says, but there is some discretion, and we, the board, will be responsible to have the ultimate oversight. Even though we have an oversight committee, they will report to us, and we have the job of making sure that it goes where it wants. So I don't see that there's this issue that all of a sudden we're going to have the election and then it's set in motion and everything happens without our oversight of it. We still have oversight. That's my view.
So I see this as a process problem that an MOU defines the relationship that we're expecting to have with another entity. And if there are concerns about what's in the MOU, I would have liked to have heard them in the public meetings that we've had, and I'm sorry, I would have liked to have heard any concern that you wanted to see a detailed budget so that we could have worked on that in process. Now, I don't think it's insurmountable. I have a suggestion, and my suggestion would be that we pull the item for tonight and we ask the charter schools to, we need to provide them with a round number of what we think their share would be. We're looking at slightly less than 10% of the $3.2 million that it's been in the past. So we're talking about $300,000 and, split it between schools and ask them to provide their intended expenditures, because I think that will address your issue of transparency. And the question is, do we have enough timeline left for that to be accomplished? So I think we pull it tonight and ask the question, can they respond, and what kind of time do they need to respond? And then we'll look at this at the next regularly scheduled meeting of the board. Because what I don't want to have is an MOU that says this is what we agree to, and then, oh, by the way, we want to add conditions after the fact. To me, that the process is you enter into an MOU, and that's what the understanding between all parties is. So if we're not comfortable with it, I think we've got to pull it.
Well, I'm comfortable with it, but I'm just as comfortable with it as I am with the parcel tax language. There's nothing in this MOU which is contrary to the parcel tax language.
But you're saying you want to see their specific expenditures,
not before we go ahead with the MOU.
But then how are you going to hold them to any particular thing that's not outlined here?
How is anybody going to hold us to it? I mean, we could do just as I said but we don't. And we have a history with our community.
But they don't.
They don't. That's why, not as a part of the MOU, but as a part of the negotiations and the conversations we have with them and part of the campaign.
But I don't think there are going to be any further negotiations. That was the point of entering into an MOU, was to define the nature of the relationship and the legalities between the two entities.
But I brought up this whole issue of specificity of the language while Mr. Trematola was speaking at. And it didn't get specified, but on the other hand, we have a history of very specific uses for the money. And all I'm asking, I mean, it's part of the conversation that we have, and I would.
But we don't run their schools. We don't run their budgets. That we define our relationship with them with legal documents, and this MOU is the defining relationship document. And if we wanted specificity, we could ask them for a budget. But I don't think that anywhere in here it says you must provide us with a budget prior to expenditures. It says you are subject to oversight, and if you want to know the specifics, I think we have to ask for them. And I don't think that we have asked for them.
I think there's almost two conversations going. As I understand it, Mrs. White is worried in general about the wording not being specific enough. It's not related specifically to the charter school. Is that correct?
Yes. But on the other hand, our history has specified.
But we have a history of 2 times of having it and spending it as expected, and so we have a history. But the issue about the MOU, we're going to have to work with them to make sure that the statements in the parcel tax are followed. And we have statements about what it will be, and that will be part of our job, to, at least for the, for sure, for the K-8 school, to say, if you're not doing that, that's a problem. I will encourage them as much as we can on the other one where we don't have detailed oversight, but it's helpful to have this involve all the schools in Livermore.
I guess what I'm stuck on is what I heard is that they can do the list of activities that you talked about, raise teacher salaries and paint a building within the language of the MOU. I think
But we could too.
within the language of the MOU, and I think that's correct. And I don't think it would be very smart of them to do that, but it's possible. And in my mind, the only way to address that concern is to ask them for an expenditure list.
So if I could just, and I'm fine either way, but I just wanted to make sure that you're making a well-informed decision. So first of all, when you mentioned, Mrs. Runyon, that you were concerned about the timeline. So our next board meeting is April 8th. And most of the voters in Livermore vote by mail, which is May 8th. So we already have a compressed timeline. I just would like the board to be aware of a more compressed timeline. I also will tell you that 2 very solid lawyers negotiated this, one from charter side, one from parcel tax measures side. And they put in 2 safeguards that maybe would make the board feel more comfortable, I don't know. But 5A says the school, this is talking about the charter schools, are obligated to expend parcel tax revenues in compliance with terms set forth in the resolution, which is what we passed, the ballot language for the parcel tax, which is the full text of the measure, which I think you would feel much more comfortable with, and any amendments thereto in applicable law. So that part was in there, as well as the fact, and this was done intentionally so, the superintendent's recommendation was not to just approve it as is. It was to approve it and delegate authority to the superintendent to make technical adjustments as may be deemed necessary on advice of legal counsel to carry out the board's intent. And so I guess what would be helpful if you, to move the process along, is if that we really clarified the board's intent tonight and then allow those technical revisions to be made with legal counsel and consultation, so not to maybe hold up the whole MOU, but to say, to really hone in. It sounds to me the board's intent is not only for this MOU, but also for us to make sure that it's clear. Because, you know, as superintendent, I inherited a parcel tax where things were already divided up, where some went for technology. And I think to honor Trustee White's concerns, I have had some of those same questions. How did we decide that 200,000 went for technology and that this amount went for there? I wasn't part of those decisions. I assumed the board was. With local control funding, everyone's going to be weighing in. And so that's the part about the budget discussion, I think, is I believe the way it happened was class size reduction came first, and then whatever was left was split up. But I don't know.
The board did not weigh in, okay. But there were the 5 things on the ballot
that were more specific,
that were required. And it was the science program in elementary school, counselors, and class size reduction. And then the rest was split among the technology and, well, first library is the first one, and then technology and enrichment class.
So I was just suggesting that, and again, not to overstep, but just to say that is one way to maybe make sure that the board's intent is still included, but to keep things going.
I still remain concerned about the process, that if you want to see specific expenditures, I think that we have to inform them that that's the case and that we expect to have some kind of an approval level.
So we could also amend it tonight
Yeah,
and add that, and you guys could approve an amended version because you have the first call at this.
yeah.
And then they have an opportunity to accept it or not, and if they don't accept it, we will still proceed. So that's another option, is you could actually amend, we could wordsmith, Margaret Gaylor could take some notes, I could take some notes, and you could propose something.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break and work on some, or a 10-minute break and work on some amended language and see if we can come up with something that will pass. So I'm going to declare we're in recess at 9:06 for 10 minutes. Listening to the prior discussion, and so could you tell us the amendment?
Certainly. So we're proposing to possibly amend this MOU with this language. Prior to April 4th, 2014, it is the expectation that LVCS and LVCP will provide a preliminary outline of intended expenditures of their portion of anticipated parcel tax funds in keeping with the terms set forth in the parcel tax resolution, the ballot language for the parcel tax, and any amendments thereto and applicable law in keeping with the LVJUSD board's intent.
Does that meet everyone's concerns? Address everyone's concerns.
I didn't have a concern with the document. I took the lead from the superintendent that this has been vetted by our lawyers and their lawyers, and they've all agreed with the wording and their intent. My thought is they're just asking for a portion of the funds. I don't know why we're dictating how they're going to spend it. They can spend it any way they want.
No, they can't. They've got to spend it in accordance with the language on the ballot.
I understand that, and then the lawyers have said this is what we're going to do, and we want to seem to fine tune it.
Well, I guess I want to know, do you have an objection to the language? Or does the language sound acceptable?
Could you read it again and what section it's going to go into?
It will reappear in a moment. I'm being technologically challenged at the moment. It will be just one moment.
You go live. I want to hear from Bill and Ann, and then I'll come back.
Okay, prior to April 4th, 2014, it is the expectation that LVCS and LVCP will provide a preliminary outline of intended expenditures of their portion of anticipated parcel tax funds in keeping with the terms set forth in the parcel tax resolution, the ballot language for the parcel tax, and any amendments thereto and applicable law in keeping with the LVJUSD board's intent.
And that's going to,
This is,
I just want to know where that was going to appear in the document.
And it would be preliminary because the parcel tax, if it were to be successful, wouldn't begin until 2015 and things could change, but it would be a general outline.
and you wanted to know
Where's that appearing? What
the
section?
location. Would it be just another paragraph at the end?
It would most likely be under 5, section 5, because it's the in consideration of the receipts. Of receipt of parcel tax revenue, the school would be agreeing to these terms, and we have them agreeing to documenting their expenditures. So I would insert it. It's kind of a subset of A or before B.
Mrs. White, it was your concern, so does this address your concern?
Yes, and I think the conversation that we've had this evening would clarify to any casual observer our intent.
Dr. Dunlop, are you comfortable with the amendment?
I was comfortable with the beginning language, and
You have
we
any
can say all of
objection?
this. I don't have any objections to this, but we relied on our lawyers to give us something that they thought solved all the problems. We've added something. Hopefully, we haven't added something that's going to be a problem. I don't think so. It sounded reasonable, but
Okay, Mr. Rogi?
Could you read the first 5 words again? You guys keep taking it off the screen. Don't do that.
can you load it on the screen?
Yeah, put it up for the public.
Prior to April 4th, 2014, it is the expectation that LVCS and
Okay,
LVC...
right there, the expectations. Do we not want to put requirements rather than expectations? Because expectations is still quite nebulous in my mind. You might expect it, but I may not do it.
Okay, so we could say prior to April 4th, 2014, LVCS and LVCP will be obligated to provide. That's the common language in the MOU, is obligated.
But you have to realize we're throwing them a real curve.
It's a very tight
Especially
timeline.
if it's April 8th, because then they would have to go through some process to decide how they're going to spend that money, and then they would feel like they're stuck. Because how do they change it after that fact if they decide, well, we really wanted to put more into the science part versus something? So
What's the second
we're
meeting
creating
in
a
April?
trap, in my view, for them. So I don't.
Another option could be prior to expending funds, but then we're back to your
that's
concern.
fine. I mean,
Or prior to release of funds, because this is all hypothetical if we never...
Yeah, but the problem is, if we're just saying you're going to provide a budget, the deciding point is at the election. And so if you're going to require that they give specificity beyond the ballot language, that, I think it's got to come prior to election. Now, I don't know how far in advance. I would be okay with the end of April, because nobody's voting until May, right? Isn't the voting window starting in May? So as long as the language is out by the time people are voting, to me, that would be okay. And I think that addresses Mrs. White's concerns about specificity, and I don't think the gentlemen object to specificity. They just...
Well, we're going to have our specificity, and you're saying they will report us theirs. But both of us are obligated to go by the language of the property tax measure. Now, if you want to ask them to tell them what their interpretation is before, what are we going to do? Tell them that's not their interpretation?
Well,
it's not in the intent of,
I was okay with the language at the beginning too. And, I think that if we'd wanted specificity, it would have been best to ask for it at the beginning of the conversation. But I can see the point that specificity is helpful, and we have a long history of specificity within our own expenditures. So, I guess that I would approve the amendment and the MOU with the amendment, and then see if they think that they can meet that timeline. If they can't, we can come back at the next meeting and reconsider. But, I'd like, if we can find consensus, to go ahead and approve something and then see if they have an objection to it. They hopefully are already thinking about what they would logically spend money on and wouldn't have a problem giving an outline of, we want to add an additional science class, we want to add additional sections of music, whatever it is within the bounds of the language. And, I think the point is that the generalities of what they say are going to be given to the Parcel Tax Oversight Committee for them to do their work of, did you adhere to the spirit of what you told us?
Well,
right?
well, I would think that they don't need to give us a complete list of what they're going to expend the $300,000 on. They're going to give us broad categories. We're going to add a science class, and even spending more than the $300,000, and they will pick and choose when they get, when it's actually part of their budget, which of these things that fit in our...
Well, but if they promise that they're going to do certain things, they can't promise more than they can do, because then
Well,
how do you hold them accountable?
This isn't a promise. This is a category of things that they're going to consider.
I believe if I ask them for a general outline, I think that they will find that to be reasonable. I agree with Dr. Dunlop that maybe asking for too much specificity in a 2-week span and expecting them to go through their process as well probably is not reasonable. But I think if we contact them and say we'd like some general idea of what your plan is, I think that's reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, I have to say that I would like what you said, President Runyon, but I'd rather reverse it. I'd rather go ahead and approve the existing document and make changes down the road after taking this wording that you've come up with, send it to the lawyers, see what they think. At least we get something on the record, and it's not really harmful to this point. We need to make the changes. We can make amendments later on down the road, but I'd rather get this done tonight.
I don't know that we can amend it because we're making an agreement with them. It's like entering into a contract. You can't approve it and then say, and now we're going to change it.
Do we know when they're scheduled to?
Well, except upon mutual agreement. If we came up with something a little bit more specific and we asked them to agree to that and they were amenable to that.
But that again would be a change.
In my view, is they're going to be bound by the parcel tax language. And you know, we can put all the words we want in, but they will come back and provide us things that meet the parcel tax language. And so I think we're basically going around in a circle. It's unnecessary here. The language in the parcel tax is what they will be judged on in terms of whether they're meeting the criteria. And we can review that for sure by in the K-12 because the K-8 school, because we'll be looking at that in detail. We don't look at the other school in detail, but they're bound by that language just like we are. And if we saying it has to be far more specific, then it's got to be more specific for us. So I just don't have a problem with this, and I think we're getting into an area which will probably cause us problems.
So I'd like to move that we approve the original memorandum under consent item G with the original wording.
And is there a second?
I'll second it.
The motion is made and seconded and we're just on item G at this moment.
Yeah.
Could the clerk call the roll?
Yes. Mrs. White.
Aye.
Dr. Dunlop.
Aye.
President Runyon.
Aye.
Myself, aye, and Mr. McLaughlin is absent.
Okay, so the original MOU as written by our attorneys is passed. And I think for completeness, we're going to go ahead and ask them anyway to provide some information so that the Parcel Tax Oversight Committee has something to judge them against in terms of expenditures without making it a requirement of the MOU.
I would also think that the campaign committee would want to have this list.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
The community is being asked to buy a pig in a poke if they aren't saying what they're going to spend the money on. And that would be pretty close to public record by then.
All right, so now if we could return to the consent item. That brings us to discussion action item. I see the first one is the Prop 39 request.
Thank you, Madam President. And Mr. Chris Van Schack, our Assistant Superintendent of Administrative Services, has the pleasure of being the oversight representative from the district to the Tri-Valley Learning Corporation. So he will present the district's final offer to the Prop 39 request for the 2 existing schools.
Thank you, Mrs. Bowers. Good evening, board members. Yes, it is a pleasure to be the oversight champion of the charter schools. And this evening, I'm here to talk a little bit about Proposition 39. And Proposition 39 was passed by California voters in the year 2000, and it had to do primarily with equity facilities, providing for facilities for all of the students in California. And this has become a major part of charter school law in that each year, according to Proposition 39, they're supposed to ask us for equitable facilities. And as you can see, Proposition 39 does state that public school facilities shall be shared fairly among all public school students, including those in charter schools, and that these facilities should be reasonably equivalent and similarly furnished and equipped. And so that's sort of the theory we go by in granting the requests. And so the timelines that we face, they have to provide us with a preliminary request in November. We have a chance to look at their enrollment figures and determine whether or not we believe them to be reasonable. this year in December. We did not find their numbers to be unreasonable, and we let them know that. We then provided them with a preliminary officer of furniture and furnishings by January 31st, or on January 31st. TVLC accepted the preliminary offer of furnishings for their elementary school, the K-8, and requested modification to the high school. And so then we did some negotiation, and this evening we are providing you with an opportunity to see what the final offer would be for the charter school. And so you see that in front of you. This is based upon their projected enrollment. There is an opportunity within Proposition 39 law for a recalibration if their enrollment changes. But currently, based upon a number of students, an increase in students at the high school level, we have made this offer. These are all for the high school level, with the exception of middle school facilities for athletics and performing arts, which are down there at the bottom. The rest of these are all for their high school program. And so we've gone through this very carefully to see what we've provided them with in the past. I did a tour of their facility, took a look at the furniture that they've already had provided to them, and feel as though this is a fair offer. And so I'm asking you this evening, as board members, to approve this final offer. And if you do, we would provide letters to TVLC outlining the specifics of these offers. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Presumably this current year, the LVCP, the high school, is offering physics, chemistry, and biology.
Correct.
And presumably they're providing those instructional activities with equipment and furniture that was comparable to art.
In some cases, yes. In some cases, they would consider it to be less than adequate because they had more of a need in science classrooms than they expected, and so they're asking for furnishings for essentially an additional classroom.
Additional classroom,
Yes.
but that's 16 lab tables. That's more than one classroom.
16 lab tables. The kind of lab tables we were talking about were 2 students at a table.
Okay.
So the smaller tables that we use in primarily our middle school classrooms. So it's a little 2-person table, so it would seat 32.
Okay, so this is going to create facilities that are more adequate than last year.
Yeah, I would say so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And presumably, I mean, they have a senior class this year, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if we're providing 100 desks, that would appear to the casual observer that they're expecting 100 additional students. Is that?
That's true. Their current senior class is the smallest of the 4 classes that they have. That was their initial class. They're around 75. They're expecting an incoming class of about 125.
Okay.
But only 100 of those are art.
Correct. So we're required to provide furnishings for those students who are residents of Livermore.
So what you're saying is last year what we provided was not comparable to what we have. And so this year they're asking for adequacy or comparability.
Yeah, that's a fair way to
Wouldn't
put it.
say that. Last year our understanding was we gave what was comparable and what they requested, and they
We
accepted
gave
our
what they requested.
Oh, okay, I believe that.
Yes.
I mean, we're not supposed to raise
Correct.
the bar.
Correct. It's not our job to determine if they've got the facilities, comparable facilities. It's their job to ask.
Their job
And
to
we provide
ask,
them with-
and we provided what
correct.
they asked for.
Correct.
Okay, and now they want more.
Another
comparability.
classroom worth of science tables. Correct.
Thank you.
Any other board member? Any member of the public? All right, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we, what do we want to do?
Approve.
Approve the final offer to the Livermore Valley Tri-Valley Learning Corporation for their request for additional furniture.
I'll second that.
And Mr. Rogie, will you call the roll?
Mrs. White,
Aye.
President Runyon,
Aye.
Dr. Dunlop,
Aye.
myself, aye, and Dr. McLaughlin is not here.
But
He's
Mrs.
absent, so
Ms.
it's
Schultz-
4 ayes.
Ms. Schultz is here.
Or-
Ms. Schultz is
Oh,
here.
I'm terribly sorry.